Right now, the Baltic is still being treated like a place where time exists. And that sounds abstract until you understand how Russia applies pressure. Because Russia's advantage in the gray zone has rarely been power. It's been tempo. The ability to move first, shape the narrative, and sit inside that slow window where everyone else is still asking, is this real? Is this coordinated? Who responds? By 2026, Sweden is one of the reasons that window keeps shrinking. Not because Sweden is itching for a fight, not because Sweden is trying to threaten Moscow directly, but because Sweden is tightening the Baltic into a pressure chamber, a space where movements don't stay isolated, reactions don't stay slow, and pressure doesn't build quietly. And here's the part that matters most. Sweden doesn't need to escalate to change the game. It only needs to be integrated enough that Russia's favorite phase, the slow phase, starts disappearing. For most of the post-Cold War period, Russia's approach to the Baltic and Nordic region relied on separation. Finland and Sweden outside NATO, the Baltic states inside but exposed, the sea contested but politically constrained. That created room for probing and signaling without triggering fast, unified responses. That structure is gone. By 2026, Sweden is helping remove the slow phase Russia depends on, the phase where movements can be explained away, coordination lags, and political hesitation buys Moscow room to maneuver. That quiet window is closing. Public defense planning through 2024 to 2025 points to Sweden rebuilding around three ideas Russia historically dislikes operating against: persistent readiness, regional integration, endurance, not episodic response. This isn't a panic buildup. It's a structural redesign. Sweden's total defense concept, rising defense spending that meets or exceeds NATO's 2% guideline in public reporting, and accelerated integration are designed for a long contest, not a one-off crisis. And geography makes that dangerous for Moscow. Sweden sits at the center of the Baltic theater, not on the edge, but at the hinge. Air routes, sea lanes, undersea infrastructure, and reinforcement corridors intersect around Swedish territory. For years, Russia benefited from the fact that this hinge was politically neutral. Now it's not. By 2026, Sweden is no longer a space NATO works around. It's a space NATO works through. That changes how the entire northern theater behaves. For Russia, the Baltic Sea has always been more than water. It's a corridor between Kaliningrad, St. Petersburg, and the wider North Atlantic. Swedish neutrality helped keep parts of that corridor politically complicated to lock down. NATO membership rewires that equation. And what makes Sweden especially uncomfortable for Moscow is that it doesn't need to be aggressive to be effective. It just needs to be integrated. By 2026, detection flows faster, coordination happens earlier, and response options are increasingly mapped before Russia finishes shaping the narrative. That is the nightmare. Because Russia's pressure strategies depend on uncertainty. Is this real? Is it coordinated? Will anyone act? How long do we have? Sweden's role removes those questions earlier in the timeline. Movements in the Baltic aren't just noticed, they're contextualized, compared, shared, logged against patterns, and folded into alliance-level awareness faster than before. That doesn't make conflict more likely. It makes pressure harder to apply. Sweden is not becoming a frontline battering ram. It's becoming a tightening force inside the pressure chamber. And pressure chamber spaces don't shout. They quietly make the environment hostile to improvisation. By 2026, Russia isn't dealing with a neutral buffer in the Baltic. It's dealing with a connected space where actions echo faster and options close sooner. And the first place that reality becomes unavoidable isn't at sea. It's in the air, because the moment Sweden's airspace stops behaving like neutral ground, the Baltic stops offering Russia room to test the edges quietly, and the first place the pressure chamber tightens is overhead. For Russia, airspace has always been the soft underbelly of Baltic deterrence, not because NATO lacked aircraft, but because reaction timelines could be uneven. Detection in one country, interpretation in another, coordination somewhere else entirely. That delay created space for signaling flights, intelligence collection, and pressure by presence without immediately forcing a unified response. Sweden's entry into NATO, and what follows by 2026 breaks that pattern. This isn't about Sweden suddenly dominating the skies. It's about Sweden changing how the sky behaves. For decades, Swedish airspace was defended, but politically detached from alliance escalation ladders. Russian aircraft operating near the Baltic could assume that probing flights and posture changes would trigger monitoring, not rapid fusion into a wider NATO air picture. By 2026, that assumption is far less safe. Sweden's air posture is increasingly oriented toward continuous integration into NATO air and missile defense structures. Shared sensors, shared command logic, shared operating pictures that can move faster than political debate. That matters because modern air pressure is about rhythm. Russia's aerial signaling relies on repetition, routine patrols, familiar flight paths, gradual escalation that tests where the threshold actually sits. When airspace is fragmented, those tests work. When airspace is fused, they lose value. By 2026, Swedish radars, airborne sensors, and command nodes feed more directly into NATO's regional awareness. A Russian aircraft approaching the Baltic is less likely to be seen by Sweden first and NATO later. It's seen through the pressure chamber, and pressure chambers don't hesitate. This compresses Russia's decision window in two ways. First, ambiguity collapses faster. A flight profile that deviates from routine isn't debated in isolation. It's compared instantly against patterns across the region. Is this synchronized with naval movement? Does it coincide with electronic activity elsewhere? That turns signaling into data, and data strips signaling of psychological leverage. Second, endurance replaces reaction. Russia often assumes the other side will surge briefly, scramble fighters, issue statements, then return to baseline. Sweden's post-2026 posture is built for something else: sustained presence without drama. Routine air policing, regular integration with allied aircraft, predictable readiness that doesn't spike under pressure. When readiness becomes routine, pressure loses its bite. Here's the first real 2026 flip in the air domain. By 2026, Russian air activity near the Baltic is more likely to produce less visible drama because the posture is increasingly designed to absorb it. Fewer emergency scrambles as spectacle. Fewer sudden posture spikes, less political theater, more continuous coverage. That's deeply uncomfortable for Moscow because coercive air signaling depends on visibility. If no one looks rattled, the signal fails. Air defense behavior amplifies this effect. Sweden's layered air defense, increasingly tied into allied sensors and early warning, shapes how aircraft operate even when no missiles are fired. Higher altitudes, longer routes, greater predictability, more fuel, more planning. Air defenses don't need to shoot to shape behavior. They just need to exist credibly and be connected. But air control doesn't stay in the air. Once airspace becomes tight, everything beneath it feels the pressure, especially ships. Because naval movement without comfortable air cover becomes riskier, slower, and more visible. And once the air above the Baltic gets constrained, everything below it starts moving differently, because ships don't maneuver comfortably when the sky above them is already inside the pressure chamber. That's where the real discomfort begins, at sea. For Russia, the Baltic Sea has never been about dominance. It's been about access, a narrow, crowded body of water where political caution, civilian traffic, and complex acoustics created room to move quietly, test boundaries, and operate below the threshold that forces decisive response. Sweden's neutrality helped preserve that balance. By 2026, neutrality is gone, and the sea behaves differently because of it. Sweden doesn't need to control the Baltic to make it hostile to Russian planning. It only needs to make movement visible, patterns traceable, and ambiguity short-lived. That's what happens when Sweden becomes more deeply integrated into NATO's maritime awareness. The Baltic is shallow, noisy, cluttered with wrecks, cables, pipelines, and traffic. It's a terrible place to hide unless you understand it better than everyone else. Sweden does. For decades, Swedish naval and research institutions studied Baltic acoustics and undersea signatures for one reason: survival in a confined maritime space. By 2026, those strengths are increasingly networked. Surface vessels, undersea sensors, maritime patrol aircraft, and shared data feeds contribute to a wider picture that travels tracks movement across the basin, not continuously everywhere, but persistently where it matters. That changes the game. A Russian ship leaving port isn't just seen, it's logged. Its route is compared. Its behavior is measured against baseline patterns built over years. This doesn't require confrontation, it just removes comfort. And comfort is what Russian naval pressure depends on. Russia's Baltic operations rely on predictable corridors, routes in and out of Kaliningrad, access to the Gulf of Finland, patterns of life that look routine until suddenly they're not. Once those corridors are watched by multiple states sharing the same picture, routine starts to look less plausible. Even submarines feel this pressure. The Baltic's shallow depth and complex seabed already limit submarine freedom. When sensor data is fused, surface tracks, acoustic cues, aerial patrols, intelligence overlays, quiet becomes relative. No single sensor needs to be perfect. The network effect does the work. This is why many analysts describe the Baltic as becoming increasingly transparent. Not because everything is seen all the time, but because more movements leave traces somewhere in the picture. Sweden's role is central because of placement. Gotland sits at the heart of the Baltic. Surveillance from that position reaches across major sea lanes linking Kaliningrad, St. Petersburg, the Baltic states, and the Nordic coast. Sweden has publicly emphasized the island's strategic importance and has made moves that align Gotland more tightly with regional defense posture. For Russia, that's deeply uncomfortable. Gotland doesn't block the sea, it watches it, and watching is often enough. Naval pressure campaigns rely on uncertainty. Is that ship here for presence, signaling preparation? When movements are tracked consistently and compared across time, that uncertainty shifts, not for NATO, but for Russia. Because Moscow has to assume it's being watched even when it can't be sure how closely. That uncertainty flips direction. Here's the second major 2026 flip. By 2026, the Baltic Sea becomes less of a gray operating space for Russia and more like a monitored corridor where every movement carries informational cost. Nothing explodes, no blockade appears, but pressure loses efficiency. A ship that assumes it's being tracked behaves differently. A submarine that assumes patterns are being logged takes fewer risks. A fleet that knows its movements feed multiple allied assessments becomes cautious. That caution is the point. Because when naval pressure stops being comfortable, Russia has to compensate elsewhere, with air activity, political signaling, or multi-theater distraction. And that's where Sweden's impact compounds. Because once the Baltic behaves like a pressure chamber, Russia doesn't just lose freedom of movement, it loses the ability to decide where escalation stays small. And that problem doesn't stop at the shoreline. Russia's pressure strategy has always depended on one fragile assumption: that escalation can be shaped faster than coordination. Move quickly, act ambiguously, force hesitation, let political friction slow response while facts on the ground or water begin to harden. Sweden's entry into NATO and what Sweden does with it by 2026 attacks that assumption. Not by being louder, not by being aggressive, by collapsing time. The moment Sweden integrates more fully into NATO's command, surveillance, and planning loops, the Baltic and Nordic regions stop behaving like loosely linked national responses. They begin behaving more like a single pressure chamber, and pressure chambers don't hesitate the way coalitions used to. Before, a Russian move in the Baltic might trigger questions. Who's responsible? Is this routine? Do we escalate? Do we wait? Those questions take time. Time is where pressure accumulates. By 2026, Sweden helps remove that delay. A movement detected in the Baltic doesn't stay a national observation. It feeds into shared air and maritime pictures. It's cross-checked against other sensors. It's interpreted against patterns already understood by multiple allies. The debate shifts from what is happening to what does this mean? And that shift happens faster. This is where Russia's escalation timeline starts to fail. Russian doctrine relies on probing without commitment. Flights near airspace, ships operating close to infrastructure, maneuvers that sit just below confrontation. The goal is an immediate advantage. It's mapping thresholds and identifying hesitation. Sweden's posture makes those tests expensive because when detection is early and coordination is routine, probing loses its exploratory value. The response may still be calm. It may still be measured, but it's no longer confused, and confusion is the oxygen of gray zone pressure. There's also a second, quieter effect. Sweden doesn't just compress reaction time, it compresses decision space. Once multiple allies see the same activity at the same time, individual hesitation matters less. Wait and see becomes harder when everyone is already seeing. That makes escalation harder to localize. A move aimed at Sweden becomes a Nordic issue. A Baltic signal becomes a NATO discussion. A single deployment touches multiple planning desks at once. Russia loses the ability to choose where the problem stays small. And that forces caution. Here's the critical 2026 flip. By 2026, Russia can no longer assume it controls the pace of escalation in the Baltic and Nordic space the way it once could. Not because NATO wants confrontation, but because Sweden helps make response more routine rather than improvised. Routine responses don't need to be aggressive to be effective. They only need to be timely. Russia's strategy counts on being faster than alliance politics. Sweden's integration makes that race harder to win. And when tempo slips, leverage leaks. That doesn't mean Russia stops operating. It means every move carries more risk than reward. Pressure that once shaped behavior gets logged. Signals that once provoked reaction meet steady posture. Escalation that once unfolded in stages runs into early clarity. That's not dramatic, it's worse. Because it forces Russia toward two uncomfortable options. Escalate more sharply, raising costs it often wants to avoid, or accept diminishing returns, conceding influence. And that's where the pressure compounds. Because Sweden doesn't act alone. And by 2026, the pressure chamber Sweden helps tighten is no longer just regional, it's continental. By 2026, Sweden doesn't change the balance by adding shock value. It changes it by removing slack. Pressure stops accumulating, probing stops staying ambiguous. The quiet phase Russia relies on starts disappearing. Russia doesn't lose leverage only when it's defeated in battle. It loses leverage when it can't control tempo. For years, Moscow's approach depended on time gaps, time to test reactions, time to exploit hesitation, time to let political friction slow coordination. Sweden's deeper integration compresses those gaps until they're no longer useful. Movements are seen earlier, patterns are recognized faster. Responses begin before pressure has time to harden. Not because NATO becomes trigger-happy, because it becomes synchronized. The gray zone only works when it's empty enough to hide in. By 2026, the Baltic is less empty, watched, cross-checked, and increasingly predictable to everyone except the side trying to exploit ambiguity. That flips the psychological burden. Russia has to assume it's being tracked even when it can't confirm how closely. That assumption changes behavior. Naval deployments grow more cautious, air signaling becomes noisier, probing carries higher informational cost. None of this closes the Baltic. None of it blocks Russia outright. It just makes pressure inefficient. And inefficiency is poison for a strategy built on gradual leverage. The compounding effect is subtle but decisive. Every year Sweden stays integrated, routine replaces reaction. Exercises replace improvisation. Shared pictures replace debates. The alliance doesn't need to escalate faster, it simply stops being slow. That's the nightmare scenario for Moscow. Because once tempo control is lost, Russia can't stack pressure without risking consequences it doesn't want. Sweden doesn't need to dominate the Baltic to reshape it. It only needs to keep the pressure chamber tight long enough that Russia's quiet window never fully reopens. This video is analysis based on publicly available reporting, official statements, and independent assessment. It discusses trends and plausible scenarios. It cannot predict future events with certainty.